Hi everybody. So this is Emma's Fireside chat. I'm just here as support for Emma and also just to help the conversation keep on flowing, that sort of thing. Emma, did you want to introduce what you want to talk about, or do you want to just jump in?
Yeah, I'll introduce it. I feel like if I just jump in, it will we'll go on a bit of a roller coaster. I don't want to throw you guys right in the deep end. So I've really been enjoying the previous Fireside chats I've been to. I've really been inspired by others' vulnerability and honesty and willingness to be open with the community about their hurts. I think that's been really important and really valuable for everyone in this community. So I kind of wanted to jump on that bandwagon. But what I want to talk about specifically is experiencing hurt within the frame of this community. Because I feel like sometimes there's a disconnect where we feel pain outside of the community and it's easy to talk about it. But sometimes when we're hurting in the community, sometimes I feel like we have a really hard time sharing that. And for me personally, I felt before that if I'm hurting or if I'm having a bad time in community, then something is wrong with me, or that I'm a bad person. But yeah, I really want to encourage people that it's okay to have bad experiences in community. It's okay to have a hard time in community, and it's okay to grieve when we're in community, because I think that's part of the natural rhythm of community, and it's not always a rhythm everyone can share well. It's really circumstantial, but yeah, I really wanted to share a little bit of my experience in Europe, which was really, really challenging 7 weeks for me. There was a lot going on during that time, and I grieved a lot in Europe, and I just kind of, wanted to share some of my grief with you guys. Just to say, it's okay to be hurting in community. It's okay to have a hard time. Yeah, cool.
Did you want to start with your story about Mary? Give us
Yeah. So, Europe was pretty wild for me. So, to give you guys a little bit of context, in Spain, I count time by where we were, and I'm so sorry if this throws non-Europe people off. I think this was about second week into the trip. My mom calls me and says, "Hey Emma, by the way, your grandpa's fallen and he's in the hospital. He broke his collarbone." And that was pretty concerning, and he fell twice on the trip. He was in the hospital the entire time. He's fully recovered now. He was in the hospital till about November. So that was pretty challenging to have that, not being able to be there with the family. And then I think it was about the third weekend. It was somewhere around Italy. I get another call from my mom, and she said, "Hey, Emma, so Mary's been really sick for a while." And Mary is a very close family friend of ours. So my mom's mom passed away when I was in grade 10 of cancer. And Mary was my grandma's best friend. They lived in the same apartment building, and they'd hang out all the time, and they just had the cutest friendship. And so after my grandma passed away, Mary kind of took on that role for us. She became a very important part of the family. She became a second grandma to me. She was amazing. And so my mom calls me and says, "Mary's really sick, and she's considering medically assisted dying." So this was kind of a thing throughout the trip. There was a couple times where she called and she's like, "Yes, they're doing it. No, they're not doing it." It was really on and off, and then there was a decision, she's gonna go through the process of medically assisted dying, but they don't have the doctor to do it, so the doctor's coming in. So this was going on for a couple weeks in the trip. And it was really hard for me to process and really hard for me to talk about and express how I was feeling. I've had deaths in the family before, but this was something so new to me that I'd never really talked about, and I wasn't talking to my family much because I wanted to be strong for them. I knew how hard it was on my mom, and the group dynamic on the trip was definitely a little weird at points, and I think every one of us on the trip was going through a lot. All of us were definitely having our moments, so I didn't always feel like I could bring it to the group because I didn't want to burden the group with this pain that I didn't feel like a lot of group members would be able to carry, and I didn't expect them to be able to carry for me. So I was really, really internalizing a lot. It was really hard to do that. And while this conversation was going on, was a time where we were starting to experience the war side of Europe. We were really learning about the history of the war, the history of the atrocities, and we went to the concentration camp, we went to Mauthausen, and we went to the Oversalzberg Documentation Museum. Yeah, and it was so hard for me to be so surrounded by death in this moment where I was preparing to grieve death. And man, at Mauthausen, I just remember being so overwhelmed. We hadn't even gone into the camp yet. Our guide was amazing, and he took us to this little model, and he kind of like showed us what the camp would have looked like when it was fully functional, and then he kind of gave us a little tour of the outside, and we weren't even inside the camp yet, and I was just so broken down, and I was already crying, and he pulls me aside. He was so kind, and he said, hey, like, if you feel like you've seen enough, if this is going to be too hard for you, like, there's no shame in saying, like, this is too much for me right now. But I really felt like I was dishonoring the victims of the camp if I did that. So I decided to continue on, and Deanna was a huge piece of that for me. She really, like, physically held me up at points and really just, like, encouraged me that it was okay to be grieving. But yeah, I was just so overwhelmed by this grief. Like, I couldn't even imagine this atrocity and this level of death that took place there. I think, from what I remember, around 90,000 people died in that camp. And it's not very big. It is just, I still have a hard time talking about it, just imagining this atrocity and imagining the killings. And then I think it was 4 or 5 days later, we were at the Oversalzberg Museum, and I ended up at one of the death boards, where I really shouldn't have been, but and they were talking about euthanasia, and killing people through that, and it was just so hard because I was thinking about Mary during that time, but I was also thinking about all these victims and how they were killed that way, and just the grief I felt was so overwhelming that I had to leave the museum. I think I made a few people uncomfortable. I was sitting outside the museum just uncontrollably sobbing, and these guys walk by and they're giving me the look like, but I remember Deanna and I were up there, we were processing a little, and I had this woman come up to me. I'd never met her before, and she just puts her hand on my shoulder, and she said, hey, sweetheart, it's okay to be upset here. Like, it's very natural to be upset. This place is weird, and it's okay to grieve. And that was kind of the first time that I'd been given permission to be sad. Something, we've been talking about in counseling a lot, that it's easier or helpful for people when they feel like they have permission to feel what they're feeling. And the fact that this stranger who I'd never met before was just so willing to come up and say, hey, it's okay to feel grief, and it's actually good to feel grief, because what happened here was wrong. What the Nazis did was wrong. Yeah. And so about 3 days later, I got a phone call from my mom, and she said, hey, I just want you to know that it's happening today. The doctor's coming in, and Mary's gonna die in an hour. And it was just so hard to know, and to have a time, and just to have to sit with that grief. I was already so overwhelmed by the grief of the concentration camp and the grief of the museum, and this grief had kind of been in the back of my mind, but it had always been the playing back and forth, is it gonna happen? And I think there was some part of my heart thinking oh, maybe I'll be able to get home before it happens. Maybe I'll be able to be with my family when she dies. But that just didn't happen. And I understand Mary was suffering, and this is obviously her choice. And yeah, Haley was really good, and she sat with me through that while that happened. But kind of the day after, which was my birthday, and that's another story for another day, guys. If you ever want a good story, ask any of the Year people about the travel day to Strasbourg. And I felt like really obligated to internalize that, because that day was really crazy. This was at no fault of the professors, but the train schedule was just out of whack, and we were running on trains and we're running off trains, and we get to Strasbourg and it's 45 degrees.
40.
It was 40.
Emotionally 45.
It was emotional. It was hot. Yeah, and it was really challenging for the group. I feel like all our rhythm and dynamic was kind of thrown off at that point. So I spent the rest of the trip kind of internally grieving, and that was really hard. We got to Paris, and I was just so burnt out and so overwhelmed by grief, and I just was sad when I woke up in the morning. Like, oh, like I just have to wake up. I have to perform another day. I just have to like be here and do this, because you know it's every white girl, 22 white girls' dream to be in Paris and be under the Eiffel Tower and eating baguettes, and I kind of felt that pressure that I put on myself to perform and not be honest with my grief, and I wasn't fully honest with my team about where I was at. I was like, oh, I made this assumption that my team would rather have me performing and putting on a happy face than having that authentic grief, because I didn't want to ruin their trip. Really broken down. It was, yeah, it's still not something I'm fully like processed or fully healed from. But it made it hard for me to come back into community, because I was still feeling that brokenness and that grief from all the death, and just from all the hard group dynamics, and from just all the stress that happened when we were traveling. And I realized just a lot of it was because of my thought that I can't be genuine with my community about where I'm at right now. Even though I know the people in my community love me very dearly, and the Europe team was just filled with so many excellent people. So yeah, I just really want to encourage you guys, when you're struggling in community, know that it's okay. Know that you're like, for a while I was like, oh, I'm having a bad experience because I'm a bad person and I have a bad attitude. But a family member dying and grieving is not a bad attitude. It's okay, and it's natural. And sometimes I feel like, yeah, it's good to be honest and say, hey guys, I'm not having a good time in this community right now, and I need support. And not everyone's always going to be able to carry that burden for you, because you know, people always have their own things going on. They have their own stress loads, and that is not a reflection of your value or their desire to care for you, but be reaching out. Deanna was so huge for that for me in Europe. I was always able to reach out for her, even though she was just so busy with dealing with all of her chaos constantly. Yeah. That's kind of just what I wanted to share with you guys. Yeah.
And like for those who haven't been on a trip, maybe first years, and obviously a lot of people know, these trips in themselves are so intense, and all of your emotions, no matter what they are just like compounded, and just so, everything is such a big deal. So not to minimize your experience.
Yeah, when you're traveling and you're not always sleeping right, you're not eating on the same schedule, you're going, like things can really build up. Even the smallest things, like having to move seats on a train, just becomes the end of the world. Yeah, I have to take my suitcase up and down off this rack one more time. I need to lose it.
Yeah, when we were talking about these experiences and stuff, you said that something that really stuck out to you were in those moments there were a few little things, like you gave us that example of when we were at the museum and that lady came up to you, those little moments of surprise that kind of really changed your perspective a little bit. Are there any other moments through this time of like grief that you can think of that kind of sparked you up a little bit?
I had another really good encounter with a stranger. When we were in Montserrat, there's this really, really beautiful church, and there's a boys choir there that sings, and I was really sick that day, like physically sick. Everyone got this awful cold in Spain. It was pretty hard, and I was still pretty sick, so I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna sit in the church, I'm gonna relax, I'm gonna wait for this choir. And I ended up sitting next to this lady, and I think she was from Texas. Maybe it was the lady in the store who was from Texas, who wanted the big Coke. Yeah, but she was from the States. And we just ended up talking about travel, and we just ended up having a really deep and genuine conversation. And at the end, when she was leaving, she was like, I can just tell you're such a genuine soul, and you're just so amazing. And we ended up adding each other on Facebook and keeping in touch a little bit. But it was just these surprises of how you can just meet these strangers, and they're so kind and so willing to like be with you in a moment, even when they don't know you and they don't like know where you're at, but they're just willing to come in and be like, hey, I see you. Yeah, and obviously there were a lot of moments with the team that were really amazing. Yeah, Katie and Emma and I had some really good McDonald's adventures when we were stressed. You could often see us sneaking off in the background, running really fast down the road. And we'd have dance parties, and there was just, in grief, there was always little moments of celebration with the group. And I think those were the little moments that, yeah, I ended up really being able to hang on to like help carry me through the next day, because even though some days were really hard, there was always just something little to look forward to.
Do you want to open it up for questions?
Yeah.
Well, first, thank you. You have a vulnerability hangover after this and feel like, what the heck, that's also normal too. I'm just going to say that right now. But thank you for sharing. We welcome that. So yeah, just thank you for that. Question going off of what you said, as someone who, there's two sides of the question. If you are someone that doesn't quite know how to verbalize what is going on, like you said, a lot of stuff was internal, but you didn't quite, it sounds like a lot of this is in reflection, being like, oh, I did this thing because I didn't feel safe. How would you recommend making your needs almost known to other people when you don't quite know how to articulate it? And also on the other side, what would you recommend for people that are seeing, hey, something's not quite right, this person is not able to articulate their needs maybe? What were some, I guess it's similar to those little moments, but could you elaborate?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend just finding someone and say like, hey, I need to talk. Do you have time and space today? Like opening that up. And I think I was just too afraid to ask that question because I was afraid of the answer of no. Like I don't have that time and space for you today. But yeah, it never hurts to ask. And it's good just to make your needs, even if you can make them known to one person. It's often, enough. And I would say on the other side of the coin, if you're on a travel term, or even if you're in community and you notice someone who's really off, it's so good just to walk up and say, hey, what do you need? Or hey, do you need something today? Because that opens up the invitation for them to articulate maybe something they want. Maybe they just want a space to share. Maybe they just need a hug. Maybe they just need a quiet breather from the chaos. But definitely like being open and saying, hey, what do you need today? Is one of my favorite questions to ask people and to be asked also.
to that too, just in my experience. I think as the person, if you're reaching out to people or if you see that people are having a rough time, and you say, hey, what can I do? Or if you need anything, and they say no, like, if they reject your offering of help, I think on that side of it, it's important to not take that too personally. Because sometimes if you're in grief and you're struggling and someone even reaches out, maybe you just aren't ready. And you need to be okay with not being ready for help yet, as well as, being okay if people aren't ready for your help yet. So, but thank you for sharing.
Thanks for that. That's good. Do you mind if I just add something
Yeah.
to that? I was just gonna say that I think sometimes in community too, because there's so many of us, it's really easy to assume that somebody else is taking care of that person or somebody else has checked in, when sometimes that's not the case at all. And sometimes that's what everybody is thinking, like, oh, somebody else will do this. So I think it's also good to be intentional about being somebody who checks in.
Yeah, so I don't want to take up more of you guys' time, but thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for listening. You guys are awesome.